Hi, you're listening to the NewSpace India podcast, a bi weekly talk show that exclusively brings insights from the Indian space activities ecosystem. I'm your host, Narayan, the co founder of India's first space focused think tank, Spaceport Sarabhai. Guests on the NewSpace India podcast help you understand space activities related macro and micro trends within India in all aspects, including space history, local industry, space science, technology evolution, law and policy, art, and more. The NewSpace India podcast is supported by Dassault Systèmes, a global leader in providing businesses and people with collaborative virtual environments to enable sustainable innovations. Dassault Systèmes solutions support startups, small and medium scale enterprises, and original equipment manufacturers in developing disruptive solutions for space launchers and satellites. Hi, and welcome to yet another episode of the NewSpace India podcast. Today we have Sriram here, who is a partner at Deloitte. Thank you so much for taking the time for recording this with me. I look forward to having this conversation where I'm going to bug you with some very interesting questions to know what you think about this sector.
It's always a pleasure to be talking to you, NP. And, I always maintain that there are very few orchestrators in the space sector outside the official channels who have been as successful as you in bringing together multitude of people for the growth of the sector. So first of all, congratulations on that, and may your tribe grow.
Thank you so much. I know we've also pulled you into the sector, so as well. So let's begin with acknowledging the work that you guys did recently that was published. A report on NewSpace India perspective that was released during the CII event just last week. It's a very interesting report that gives an overview of the sector at the very high level. I've been passing that on left, right, and center to a lot of the people that I know who are asking me after Chandrayaan 3, what is happening in India, and want to know about the industry to a large extent. So thank you for putting together that report and sharing several call to actions in there, including a synopsis of some of the startups and SMEs and other key contributors in the ecosystem.
In fact, thanks for bringing that up, NP. In India, the space sector has been a fantastic story. Post the Prime Minister sitting down and personally inaugurating Indian Space Association, and you see ISRO chairman working with so many startups, be in the new technology launches or their office openings, and then you have Chandrayaan, then you have Aditya, then you hear about India joining Artemis Accords. The buzz in the market is at an all-time high, so to speak. I really hope that this all-time high keeps on increasing. But nevertheless, there are insiders who know everything that's happening. But from an outside-in perspective, to understand what exactly is happening in the sector, why is it that there is a sudden new buzz? Is it part of a larger plan? Is this accidental? Are some questions that a lot of people have been asking. And as a consulting organization, which has a global practice in space sector, we have been following this for a long while. And we find, this whole concept of new space, intriguing, because earlier people used to define new space as private sector participation in space. But fundamentally, as Deloitte, we believe new space is not just that. It's all about doing few things differently, especially for a country like India, where space was held within the government sector by ISRO. We see new space driving a lot more democratization. In the sense, democratization with private sector partnership. We see new space driving a lot of decentralized approach, where all decision making, etc., is not just in the hands of ISRO, and a lot more private sector and multiple allied agencies that have been set up by the government of India, who are now starting to play a key role. And lastly, we're also seeing a lot of private participation, global collaboration, foreign investments flowing into startups, cross-border partnerships between space agencies. and India sitting perhaps on the high table of space diplomacy as well. So a lot of things have changed, and a lot of things will continue to change if government really goes in the space. And the launch of the April space policy is also a key step in this direction, which has really accelerated the whole journey. So according to us, if you look at new space, it's just not about privatization. It's about a new regulatory regime in new space. It's about new financing trends that are coming in new space. It's about new collaborations that have started in new space, and the new space ecosystem in India being driven jointly by the private sector and the public sector alike. So all of this is what is really driving this whole new space ecosystem. And our report does give an outside-in perspective of what is happening in the space sector, and also some specific calls to action on how to accelerate some of the things that have been happening.
Right. For the benefit of the audience, I will include a link to the report so that people can download it and access it and read it in their own time to make their own conclusions to a large extent. So you have been looking at several other sectors, obviously outside of space, as a part of your portfolio. You've looked at so many sectors that are probably 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times bigger than space when it comes to the activity that is going on there. So, we in the space bubble, we're restricted to what is happening in our sector because our knowledge and our experience is limited to this sector. And I'm sure that, if you look at sectors like power or infrastructure or others, you will see something that is 100 times, 10,000 times bigger to a large extent. So given that you do have this perspective of looking at different industries, and then you're now looking at space, coming from a consulting kind of a background, what do you see the trends as in the space sector in India? And are there similarities of how the power sector took off in India, or how infrastructure took off in India? And is that story also being replicated in space? Is that what you feel?
A very interesting question. Thank you for that. So if you look at a few decades ago, when India privatized their telecom as well as aviation, right, one could never fathom the kind of innovations that have happened and the kind of private sector participation that has really driven the sector, right? Those days of BSNL, MTNL, you would have seen some things, and now we are talking of a completely different approach where perhaps you and I are speaking on a video call or recording a podcast sitting across countries. Now, assume that sector grew X in 20 years, right? There are many people who believe that space sector could grow more than X. Is it 2X? Is it 3X? It's waiting to be unfolded, right? Now, with giant strides being made in terms of Earth observation information that is being increasingly used for decision making, or looking at outer space as a new field for, say, exploration for both sustaining life and energy in Mother Earth, or even many people talk about setting up colonies there, right? Space is going to take a completely different trajectory. Now, the trajectory will be built basis successes, small and large, but in a continuous fashion. Now, when will the real domino effect start to happen in the space sector is a question that perhaps, it's a crystal gazing. But when that domino effect really starts to happen, then at least I believe personally that we would soon start to see space as a service, right? What I mean by space as a service is think of a electrical engineer who is wanting to ensure the health of high power lines for transmitting electricity, and he or she would be using an app on the mobile phone which has got EO data, which tells that these are the power lines that could be under higher stress or strain, and these are the ones that they should go for a preventive maintenance or repair. Or the same thing could be for a farmer who has a very large tract of land, she would know that this is the area that she should look at, because this is the imagery that's on her phone. She knows that this particular patch of land could be pesticide starved. So all of these has the potential of transforming space in the downstream, if I look at it in the long run. And when that tipping point happens, space would no longer be talked about by the higher echelons of the scientist community. I would see space becoming a common point of conversation for a common man like you and I, right? Even now, people are talking of what do you call, was the strength of the Vikram lander leg sufficient? Why it was tilted at this particular angle and why not at a Y particular angle? People are talking of what is a Lagrange point where Aditya is going to be parked for looking at the sun. The dialogue is increasing, but when this tipping point or this dominoes effect happen, I would see space becoming more and more consumable, more and more affordable, more and more appreciable by the common man, at least on the downstream. On the upstream, it's all about, again, it could be about technology advancement, so on and so forth. But I also see a distant, not so distant future where the technologies that India is, taking great strides in. One is ISRO. But if you look at outside ISRO, also new technologies, startups are bringing in, like space situational awareness, or things like green propulsion, or things like electric propulsion, or laser-based communications, etc. All of this has the potential to disrupt other sectors, other allied sectors as well. And perhaps when these things start to happen, that's when the domino effect will start, and then space would become, like you said, it won't be. You would probably say another 10 years or sooner, have another podcast and say, "Oh, tell me which sector is as big as space, which is 100 times smaller in size than space."
I hope that really comes together in the next few years. But interesting thoughts in there, where you specifically talked a little bit about the growth trajectory and so on, and obviously the idea of new innovators in other sectors, also then replicating the model in space, comes down to new actors also coming in. And that means that essentially you are talking also about young new companies like startups that are entering the sector to do something more disruptive in that sense. So you do see the startup landscape in space evolving over the last 20 years, starting from prominent companies like SpaceX that are now today over 20 years old, to the most youngest ones that are popping out around the world in that sense. Is there any comparison to what you see as with the space startup landscape that is happening in India, versus other, or also where do you think the prominent growth areas are for startups that are coming out from India?
Yeah, I'd like to approach this in a slightly different fashion. Space, by definition, is multidisciplinary, right? If you look at upstream, it's multidisciplinary from physics to chemistry to complex mathematical equations, or multiple engineering disciplines like mechanical engineering, electronics, electrical engineering, etc. Right? On the downstream, again, for making sense of data and doing analytics, it's AI, ML, computer science, data science, all of them, coming in together. While India is making specific inroads, and a lot many startups are coming up in very niche areas like some downstream analytics, or some launching capabilities, or some maneuvering capabilities, or satellite building, etc. The question you asked, like a SpaceX, an end-to-end capability, how soon would that happen in India? Now, it's a question of two things. It's a question of one, an ability to invest in, and an ability for a large industry house to really see the future potential of this sector currently in India. And there is no dearth of talent, and the ability for such investors to collectively harness the potential of the multidisciplinary capability towards a common cause. When that happens, perhaps you would see an end-to-end a space startup or a company forming to take shape and then grow. The heartening fact is that there are already existing tier one suppliers of ISRO who have perhaps grown in that particular manner basis the demand that has come from ISRO. And they have been catering to ISRO's demand predominantly, and perhaps will cater to international demand also in the future. But a prominent investing company or investor coming in and collectively creating a new a space organization, if I may use that word, given the opening up of the sector, to drive different and newer economic opportunities or revenue streams, would perhaps help create the next SpaceX kind of thing in India. How far is it? Your guess is as good as mine, because it's a matter of the right people showing the right interest on this very right sector.
And I think it comes down to the question of how do you make the pie bigger also to a large extent to a lot of the people, right? So there are two distinct communities in the space sector in India, as I see it. One is the traditional SMEs that have been working with ISRO for several years to a large extent to help them produce stuff for their rockets and satellites. And it's like a mill where high quality products are assembled and given off for ISRO to fly these missions and make it successful year on year to a large extent. But there's not a lot of design knowledge available in several of these houses, where there's a lot of infrastructure, quality control, quality assurance, handy people with good skills or ensuring good quality products get out, but not really don't have the design knowledge for a lot of that stuff that sits inside of ISRO to a large extent. And that's true for even big or small vendors that are present with ISRO today. But then there's lots of new companies like Pixel and Satshore and Bellatrix and several others that are around that are looking at investing their own IP into their own IP, looking at their own products to a large extent. So there are these two distinct communities that are in play. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what you do, but you have to look at the pie being increased so that you can grow as a sector and you can grow as a player in that, right? So how do you see this question of the pie becoming bigger? And there's a lot of expectation that a lot of these companies will grab international market and grow from making from India for the world directly. And there's also the story of what can they make for India to a large extent. So how do you see this working out?
The question that you asked is, how do you make the pie bigger? And that's a very interesting question, given that one, this is a capital intensive industry, number one. Number two, it is made to order industry most of the time, unless there are allied parts that can be used in other industries as well. Now, when you have these two constraints, a strong statement of demand, either from the Indian public enterprise, or where some of these mature companies can cater to the demand of international players, both of them have to come together. So that way, one, the appetite to invest by investors, the appetite to invest by the local parties, and the appetite to innovate will also increase, because one, you have a future outlook which is kind of firmed up for the next 3 to 5 years, and you have a financial potential which has been ascertained for the next 3 to 5 years, and hence your ability to put more money into R&D and put more money into procurement, etc., increases, and because there's a strong return of investment that could perhaps be modeled. So that is point number one. Now, so that is what the tier one companies typically, the growth trajectory for the tier one companies that would be there. Whereas, the companies which have been suppliers to ISRO. And from the other side, some of the startups that you're talking of, how do they really, grow the pie? The question there perhaps boils down to they catching on to a particular business problem that has been hitherto unsolved. Now, that unsolved business problem or an unsolved new area of work, if they can get into it, that will, which has the promise of a larger revenue potential, will attract investors to them. So that investor attraction will result in they becoming bigger and growing the pie. Now, my belief is when both these two cohorts join up, because the latter cohort, perhaps at this stage as we speak, do not have the complex quality testing, assembly integration testing, or those kind of capabilities. Now, when the latter cohort can tie up with the former cohort who has got deep experience and capability and have so many what you call scientists working with them in these niche areas which are required for productionizing a particular technology. So there is a pilot part of a technology or a conference room view of a technology, but productionizing a technology and making it space grade is a completely new game. But when both these cohorts can join together, that's when perhaps the magic happens, and that's when perhaps the domino effect starts happening. So really look forward to some of these tier one companies also starting to embrace these startups, like ISRO has started to embrace them, and working in conjunction on solving a common problem, leveraging the facilities that they have, and also leveraging the innovation that the startups are bringing together. So perhaps some policy intervention from government or some some newer funds being set up by government for enabling some of these could really take the industry forward, or increase the pie as you asked.
Right, right. So there is also the question of capital that comes into play, and the sources of capital as well. We know that maybe 10 years ago or so, the capital sources for something as risky as space was almost unavailable unless you are, some crazy billionaire who wants to invest some money in a small company as an angel. But today, this has also changed to a large extent. You see several local venture capital firms or even private equity firms looking at taking stakes at some of the companies that have come forward. But then there is also a certain level of cap, maybe because of the fund sizes that are in India in itself. So there's a lot of companies that have taken small pieces of several of these companies, and often the range in which they come to play is often less than $5 million, before which somebody needs to perhaps look at a more global focused VC firm or a US focused VC firm, and then raise money from there to have the Series A and beyond scope of investment that is perhaps not available in India at this point of time. There has also been like news about the FDI policy being worked on for streamlining all of this kind of activity and so on. So how do you see this playing out? Do you see, like, from your perspective, that there is going to be movement towards much more capital at the Series A, B level locally being available, or will the trend be more like, other sectors where whatever Ola or Flipkart and anybody else who was looking at growth had to go and raise from other places? How do you see this playing out?
See, end of the day, an investor would want to invest basis the financial fundamentals and the prospects of return. Now, again, I go back to previous statement when we said it's capital intensive and made to order. And in the absence of a demand, formal demand statement, it's quite difficult for an investor or for a company to really put some numbers and run some spreadsheets and look at potential profitability or plans. That's point number one. Point number two, currently the sector has got a lot of eyeballs, right? Because of significant mileage being provided by the government, and also riding on top of Chandrayaan and Aditya successes. Now, again, while there are companies that could capitalize on that success for short-term, smaller fundraisers, the success of a larger fundraise would be predominantly basis one, a strong business model that will solve an existing hitherto unsolved business problem, which can have a bigger potential. So, end of the day, it is not the branding or the market attractiveness of the sector that would bring in more capital into it, but it's like every other industry, it is going to be the financial soundness of the plan and the business proposition. So are these companies, startups, going to look at newer markets to enter into, like a what do you call, a space situational awareness or a debris management or even things like low Earth orbit maneuvering systems, or even tomorrow for dual use purposes, some kind of invisible, making the space objects invisible. Are these that some of these areas that people are going to work on, which may have a bit in business potential and a proven business case? Then if that is going to be the case, then money will flow in. But again, in the absence of any concrete business modeling data to prove that this is the market size, this is the addressable market size, this is the pie of the market that you would get, it's always like a first mover advantage, right? But it's always a first mover disadvantage as well, because there doesn't exist any market sizing or market details that is available for an investor to get confidence in. So it goes as a mix in terms of a bit of crystal ball gazing plus a bit of market fundamentals, and both has to come together for these people to be able to raise significant capital to grow. At what point these come together? Again, as I said, it matures as the industry matures.
Right. And following on the maturity of the industry, the government, as you said, has also taken several steps towards this, maturity of the sector. And a couple of them that I can think of that are quite key are such as setting up of NewSpace as a promoter and a regulatory body in the sector. And there's been other interesting changes that they've made, such as the exemption on GST for companies that are planning to provide the launch service out of India, so that they can pass on the benefit to the customer to a large extent. And there's a few more of that being done as a part of the prioritization of the sector. But, overall, from your perspective, do you have a sense of any further important changes that need to be done? There's been a call for an NewSpace bill, for example, to make it legislatively backed regulator at the moment, which it is not to a large extent. And are there any such immediate log of pointers that you have that you think are should be some of the top priorities when it comes to the government?
See, one is the Space Activities Bill has to see the light of the day, which will further clarify and give teeth to the specific organizations that are currently there, number one. Number two, this can also perhaps remove the the potential multiple hats that some of these agencies who are mentioned in the space policy, make it proper, right? Some agencies are wearing multiple hats, which could be perceived as a conflict of interest. So that is the second thing. The third thing that could also be there is some kind of putting out of a demand by ISRO and government and all of these people for, as I mentioned earlier, for making the industry a little more attractive, because a stated demand drives production, drives more demand and more investments. Then also there is this question of we are sitting in the Amrit Kal, and if it in this Amrit Kal, if we cannot become self-reliant or Atmanirbhar, it would perhaps be a missed opportunity. So for us to really become Atmanirbhar in space, what are the things that the government should intervene in terms of the manufacturing capabilities across the value chain, right? So today we see that there are certain impacts in certain geographies can have an adverse impact in multiple industries. We saw it during the COVID time. Similarly, how do you make our space sector value chain more resilient? Because it's just not one. It's a combination of capabilities coming from multiple countries to provide to build a spacefaring object, right? So in this Amrit Kal, what can the government do for us to become more self-reliant? So that's the other question that can happen. And most importantly, like the defense space challenge that kind of catalyzed a lot of conversations around this. So perhaps there could be a commercial space challenge that could be really be, which the Prime Minister did talk about, could soon be executed, that can again rally the industry together, as well as build in new partnerships with the tier 1 companies and startups, with existing players who are working in allied industries. For example, if there is somebody who's working on ceramics, and tomorrow would that ceramics industry person would want to tie up with some of the startups who are looking at much more heat resistant material that gets into a rocket or a launch vehicle. What would be those kind of collaborations? So it can also drive, these challenges can drive also the hitherto non-space companies to collaborate with space companies to create additional value.
Right, interesting. And one of the other things that we actually didn't touch upon is the opening up of the defense space market in India. There's been some interesting movement there as well, with IDEX also creating a space challenge. There's been also now a few tenders that have been moving forward, and one of them already having procured for 2 satellites to be built by the industry as well. So there's some movement with respect to that. There's a talk of a constellation, for example, that will be built together by ISRO and the industry, with a large portion of some of the satellites to be built by the industry for the requirements. So there's all of that that is happening. There's a likely chance that as the conflicts increase and as India's adversaries are increasing their capabilities as well, that the requirements that come up from the defense are going to outpace several of the civilian requirements as well, or they may be very urgent for procurement as well. So given that this also plays into what you already mentioned of localization or local development of technology, how do you see this as a major game changer for the industry?
See, given DRDO is tasked with a lot of these defense specific uses, and ISRO is looking mainly at commercial specific uses, and the fact that most of the technology could be dual use, right? It's all about putting an asset on the outer space, and what it senses is a matter of interpretation. If you're sensing a potential flood, downstream, then it could be used for evacuating people as emergency response, or it could be even used for rerouting and an army entourage or movement of armed forces logistics, right? So it's a matter of interpretation on how some of these things could be used. Some of them are very hardbound. Some of them are loosely coupled and loosely defined as well. I would see, given that these are very different in terms of uses, and one of them is strategic from a national security and defense perspective, I would see they charting a specific path for themselves, which will be more about strategic area monitoring and more about building more strategic capabilities like ISR and so on and so forth. Whereas I would see the commercial part of the industry looking at capabilities in terms of downstream data analytics for improving the efficiencies as well as improving the sectoral outputs of multiple sectors, be it agriculture, be it infrastructure, be it urban, so on and so forth. So I see both of them, going in with different perspectives, but somewhere converging in terms of the space assets that's on sky, as well as in the downstream, at least for the commercial sector. The government has a stated ambition in terms of in the future, perhaps, as I mentioned in one of the first few questions that you asked, space could become a service. And the moment that space as a service kind of models start emerging, then, if it has emerged in the commercial sector, I would perhaps believe that similar models would have already emerged in the other sector as well, because there, it is not ROI which drives, some of the investment, but it's all about future readiness and future preparedness that drives the investment. And so I would see that course taking a different trajectory, and this taking a different trajectory, but somewhere converging in terms of technology capabilities.
There's been obviously a lot of talk of several of the companies. In fact, the Prime Minister himself has encouraged several of the new space companies that have come up and has tweeted about them, mentioned them in some of his Man Ki Baat and other places that he really comes out and talks and engages with the public. And there is this thing that is so interesting that several people believe that some of these companies should only focus on being, looking at customers globally, which the software industry did in India to a large extent, or the biotech industry did in India to a large extent, and replicate some of that story when it comes to space as well. But historically, we have seen that for the space sector to take off in any part of the world, be it US or even China and other places, including Europe or so on, the government has become a very key anchor for the sector to get initial demand locally, to establish a certain level of capability, capacity, reliability, proof that things work, before which before they go after international customers and leverage the brand of engaging with their local government and local agencies to then market it abroad, right? So there's not a lot of example of people directly going and selling it to somebody in an international market and growing a business that is extremely large, especially when it comes to the upstream, if not the downstream of the industry. So how do you see the role of a local anchor customer in India, and could what kind of local anchor customers could there be, or if it is necessary to have a local anchor customer and this model at all, or so on?
That's a very, very good question. And in fact, on your previous statement of large software companies having uh, grown in the offshore model and less catering to the Indian construct. But I think one thing that now as a country we have started taking into cognizance is the scale of opportunity that India provides. And that's why we are seeing now UPI, we saw CoWIN, we are seeing ONDC, we are seeing Aadhaar, right? Now the digital inclusiveness in the country has increased many, many fold. Now that lays a very solid foundation for the government to really up the ante for using some of the space-based application data for the common person. Now, tomorrow, as a hypothesis, let's assume if government says that all the space data that is being beamed down, there is a mechanism by which from Indian space assets to the international space assets, government is able to create a platform and kind of look at the imagery, classified, define it properly, make it much more consumable in terms of a platform, and calls it a digital public good. Imagine what it will do to the industry, right? None of the startups, or perhaps most of the startups, would cease to go abroad for their demand or everything, at least the downstream, and start looking at India as the predominant market. Because if we can succeed here, then definitely they can succeed elsewhere, given the scale, the complexity, and the nature of the terrain and everything that is there in India, right? So I would believe that somewhere the role of an anchor customer in the form of a government, and I'm not saying this is the answer for all governments across all jurisdictions. Given that it is India, and given that we have scale, given that we have the demographic dividend, given that we have had the successes in terms of digital public good, perhaps this is the time for the government to again look at ways of making space-based information or types of data or data sets or whatever as a digital public good, and come up with some kind of policy that says that each of the sectors in the government, agriculture sector should look at certain space data for certain decisions. Somebody should look at certain space data for crop insurance. Somebody should look at certain space data for deciding, when to remove the stubble, so on and so forth, right? So if government can come up with policies and being the anchor customer and being the ability to provide for investments, then perhaps this could be the beginning of the domino effect that we already talked about.
Right. And, one of the other things that we have to look at here is the general trajectory for the next few years. To a large extent, we have seen how things are evolved in the last 10 years, when the new space movement kind of started with some of the companies, and now it's snowballing. At this point of time, I happened to download some of the information from the InSpace portal on the number of registered startups, and I was kind of baffled to see that there were some 500 companies or so who were registered themselves as a startup in their website, and so on. So it looks like there's quite a lot of interest that is speaking with respect to space. So where do you see this sector from your lens as a consultant who has looked at other sectors and now is also looking at space in the next 5 to 7 years?
Yeah, I'd like to split it into two areas, one downstream and the other upstream. When you look at downstream, given again India's technology capability in STEM, as well as the talent that is already available, and the fact that if we can democratize the data that is beaming down, then it's easy for that part of the business to take off, and that the trajectory and the orbit could be very different compared to what we currently have now. So that is an easier problem to solve, and and given where we are at this point of time in our history, that is something that's got a higher probability of significant runaway success downstream. Now, when I look at upstream, again, as we talked earlier, it's all about capital intensive and made to order and demand driven, so on and so forth, right? And it takes a lot of financial muscle to pull through something, to put an object on space. Now, again, for that part of the business to really take over, I would really see a lot more of technology transfers that have to happen from ISRO, which now has started. I would like to see a lot more of exchanges of scientific information or better collaboration with ISRO scientists and some of the private sector scientists working on innovation. I'd like to see a lot more investment into institutes of higher education in India on space technologies, basically on the upstream side, creating of more interdisciplinary approaches to build that scientific temperament, as well as some big corporates or investors wanting to invest in this particular area, as apart from leveraging what they get from this into other allied sectors that they already may be operating upon. So while downstream, I would say the next 5 to 7 years really taking off given where we are in India. For upstream to move into a similar trajectory would need a lot more interventions. All the interventions that we talked so far would be important for that to really happen. And given the optimistic that I am, and I really hope that there are people listening to this podcast, many of them have the decision-making authority, and they will take some of the things that we discuss in this conversation into consideration.
Right, and I would say I have one last final question that may be again interesting to get your perspective. And before I ask that, I will thank you for your time again for being on this show and sharing some of the interesting thoughts that you have behind this. So there are obviously interesting new things that are happening with startups also forcing existing SMEs to now innovate their business because some of these companies can run away with a lot of the business by accelerating with their innovation as well, right? So recently when I visited Bangalore, one of the things that I noticed is at least 3 or 4 SMEs that have been in the sector and working with ISRO for a long time have now started making some significant investments when it comes to satellite building themselves as well. There's been a few strategy changes that I'm seeing now that are starting to occur in the traditional ISRO group of companies who have been catering to the space as well. It's a very interesting new dimension because these companies have held out in making such investments for a long time, and things are now starting to move in their front as well. And they obviously have capital available from their own pockets to a large extent to be able to take such risks at this point of time, which lowers their obviously if they're taking that decision, it comes with them having understood the risk, being in business for quite a long time, and that's and they see obviously an opportunity while taking such a risk. So is there any advice that you would say that you would want to give to existing players, depending on the size and the grouping of them or their activity? If you had to say that SMEs could look at this or startups should look at this, is there any specific advice that you would like to share?
See, space has been a sector that has been held with a lot of intrigue because we always use the word rocket science in our vocabulary, right? So I believe it's a time for us to kind of demystify that rocket science into what goes into making a space object. Rather than that, we should start looking at the value that a space object can give to a common man. The moment that narrative shifts, like I said, a farmer, if she can really look at a pesticide starved area in her patch of land, right? Or a utility worker who can really say, this is the area that I want to go for preventive maintenance. The moment we are able to shift the narrative from a rocket science kind of concept into a common man application kind of concept, things will start to change. For that, there is a lot of work that is needed to be demystified right from our education system onwards. Now, we have the right momentum and the right events in history that has happened in India for us to make that change. Right? Now, you talked about the Prime Minister's Man Ki Baat, and if the Prime Minister, or I also saw in MyGov recently, the Honorable Chairman throwing up a quiz on Chandrayaan 3, open to general public. Government has already started capitalizing on this to increase and accelerate the pace of adoption of scientific temperament in this particular country. So my point to the SMEs would be to say, yes, we are solving certain problems technically, but what does it mean from a social impact or an economic impact, or what does it mean to a common man? Can we start having those conversations out in the public? That would be point number one. Point number two is that, while everybody wants to innovate and create their own IPs, space is a sector that demands collaboration. It's a sector that where one subcomponent manufacturer or one sensor manufacturer or one downstream specific component manufacturer has to work with others across the value chain. So be there out in the ecosystem, work with your peers or work with your competition or work with established tier one companies or even work with ISRO to make sure that you are adding incremental value to their own businesses as well, apart from your own business. And then lastly, at the end of the day, it is not about one person takes the entire credit and walks away. It's the industry that has to really grow. Now, while we have that in the ecosystem view for collaboration and for gaining skills, capabilities, knowledge, funding, so on and so forth, also have that view of how the whole industry can really grow. And it is just not about the space industry alone, because everything that is being used in space today, perhaps it's a lofty statement I'm making, everything that is being used in space today perhaps will find an application on the Earth few years down the lane, right? What could perhaps fuel a rocket today, certain parts of it or some variations of it could fuel a Formula One race, in a decade to come, or perhaps even sooner. So think of an allied industries concept and not just think of space alone as the sector for an SME to succeed. Think of the larger ecosystem, think of collaboration, and think of working together to succeed. That would be my advice. But most importantly, end of the day, it all boils down to business fundamentals. Where is the money? What is the ROI? What is the outcome? And who is going to benefit by when? Stick to business fundamentals. Look at space as the next frontier. Work with allied industries. Ensure that you're able to provide to allied industries. Work with the ecosystem. And most importantly, collaborate.
Thank you so much, Sriram, for taking the time again. I think there's quite a lot of interesting wisdom for anybody listening to this particular episode. And I hope your work continues and your team's work continues to make an impact in this sector and supporting the industry as such.
In fact, yes, thank you, NP, for this conversation. More than anything else, it's as a proud Indian, I can say that, like all of us, I also stood at an aero bridge and didn't let my plane take off till I heard that Vikram landing has been successful. So I am like one of the crores of Indians who are really on the sidelines and cheering and appreciating the growth of our sector. And I really hope that people like yourself who are bringing multiple stakeholders and actors together for the common cause, we can all work together to make India a real space power. Thank you so much. Good day.
Thank you for listening in to this episode of the NewSpace India podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share this episode with anyone you believe will enjoy listening to it. You'll be able to find the NewSpace India podcast in any of the podcasting platforms that you may be using, including Apple, Google, Spotify, YouTube, and others. Do subscribe to the podcast in case you want to receive new episodes automatically. I'm grateful if you're able to leave a rating for the podcast, which will help others discover it. Thank you for listening in again, and the next episode will be out in the next 2 weeks as usual.